Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the global impact of Donald Trump's tariff policies.
Oh, yeah.
Those headline-grabbing moves that really kind of shook up the world economy a while back.
Yeah.
We've got 3 reports here titled Trump versus World that really break down, what happened after these policies were put in place.
Right.
And they argue that things didn't exactly go according to plan.
Right.
And they suggest that everyday people, particularly middle and lower class families, really felt the consequences.
Yeah, it's really interesting. These tariffs, they weren't just about, changing some numbers on a spreadsheet or whatever. They represent a pretty big shift in American trade policy, one that we're honestly still dealing with today.
Okay, so let's set the stage here.
Yeah.
Trump's goal was to revitalize American industries and tackle those trade deficits, right? He saw tariffs as the tool to make that happen. But the question is, did it work?
Right.
These reports suggest that the ripple effects were massive and maybe not in the way that he intended.
Yeah, and it's important to understand what a trade deficit is before we go too much further.
Okay.
Essentially, it means that a country is importing more goods than it's exporting.
Right.
Trump saw this as a problem, believing it hurt American businesses and workers.
So he slapped a 25% tariff on steel imports and 10% on aluminum.
Right.
And then there was that escalating trade war with China impacting over $360 billion worth of goods. It was a bold move for sure.
Yeah, and he was able to do all of this by invoking Sections 232 and 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. Now, these sections essentially allow a president to bypass Congress and impose tariffs unilaterally. It's interesting, don't you think? How much power should a president have when it comes to trade policy?
That is a great question. And as you can imagine, other countries weren't exactly going to sit back and just watch this happen.
Yeah.
The reports detail how other countries like China, the EU, Mexico, and Canada all hit back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They retaliated.
Yeah.
Remember those soybean farmers who were struggling a few years back?
Yeah. Well, this is a big part of why, China, one of the biggest buyers of U.S. soybeans, pretty much stopped importing them.
So the intention might have been to protect American industries, but these reports suggest it backfired in a lot of ways. Did anyone actually benefit?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Right.
While some industries may have seen short-term gains, the reports focus more on the broader negative impacts. And they point to the World Trade Organization, the WTO,
Right.
as a key player in this whole thing. Many of Trump's moves were criticized by the WTO. And in some cases, they even ruled against the U.S.
Wow.
But the reports also question, whether the WTO is really equipped to handle these kinds of disputes in today's global economy.
So we've got tariffs going back and forth, global trade is in a frenzy. But what did this all mean for the average person? How did it hit our wallets?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
All right.
These reports dive into how these policies actually increase the cost of living, especially for people who are already struggling,
Right. For example, washing machine prices in the U.S. went up by 12%.
Wow.
Imagine having to replace a broken washing machine when you're on a tight budget.
Oof. Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the U.S. that was feeling the pinch. The reports show that bread prices in Mexico spiked by 8%.
Really?
Because of tariffs on wheat imports from the U.S., and even in Europe, car buyers saw prices increase by like 6%.
Huh.
It really makes you think about how connected the global economy really is.
It does for sure.
And if we kind of zoom out and look at the big picture, this is all tied to inflation, which is this complex thing that can be influenced by so many different factors, including trade policy.
Yep.
And the reports focus on how these policies impacted emerging economies like Turkey and Argentina, which were hit particularly hard. They already had pretty high inflation rates, and these trade wars basically just made things worse.
Right.
We're talking 15.2% inflation in Turkey and a crazy 53.8% in Argentina in 2019.
Wow.
It makes you wonder how much of that can be directly linked back to these trade wars.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Let's get specific. These reports really zoom in on how these policies impacted different industries and the people who work in them. We talked about soybean farmers.
Right.
But they weren't the only ones feeling the pressure. U.S. soybean exports to China dropped by a huge 75% in 2018.
Wow.
This wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. This was about families losing their farms, their livelihoods, their legacy because of political decisions made thousands of miles away.
That's right. And the impact went beyond agriculture. The reports show how the tariffs on steel and aluminum affected manufacturing, too.
Right.
Ford and GM, two of the biggest American car companies, each lost $1 billion in 2018.
$1 billion.
$1 billion just from the increased cost of steel.
Wow.
This wasn't just about, theoretical economics. This was about real jobs being lost.
The reports also highlight how these tariffs affected something we often take for granted, mobility.
Right.
New car prices in the U.S. shot up by 20%. And this really hurt low-wage workers who rely on their cars to get to work to take care of their families.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget that trade policy isn't just about numbers and graphs. It really has a direct impact on people's daily lives.
And to add another layer of complexity to all of this, the reports also talk about how these trade tensions and sanctions, which often came along with the tariffs,
Right.
had a knock-on effect on global fuel costs.
Mm.
So it wasn't just the price of goods that went up, but also the cost of transporting those goods and the cost of people getting around.
Right.
It was like a multi-pronged squeeze on household budgets. Perfect storm, really.
And then there's the political side of things, which these reports don't shy away from.
Yeah.
China seemed to play its cards pretty strategically, placing tariffs on corn and pork specifically from Iowa and Ohio,
Right.
two swing states that were crucial to Trump's win in 2016. It really shows how trade can be used as a political tool,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
how economic decisions can be made for political gain.
But it didn't always work out the way they planned.
Oh, really?
The reports give an example of Harley-Davidson,
Oh, yeah.
that iconic American motorcycle company.
Right.
They actually moved some of their production to Europe because of the tariffs. And
Yeah.
what happened? 800 jobs lost in Wisconsin.
Wow.
Another state that was important to Trump's base. It seems like those tariffs backfired in some pretty big ways.
Yeah. Ouch. So it seems like those tariffs really did create more problems than they solved.
Yeah.
The reports highlight some pretty major lasting consequences.
Hmm.
Global trade actually shrank in 2019,
Wow.
the first time in years, and we're still dealing with, those messed up supply chains today.
Exactly. Remember that chip shortage a couple years back?
Oh, yeah.
That delayed, like, millions of cars.
Right.
That was partly because of all these trade tensions we've been talking about. And here's something that really stood out to me in the reports.
Okay.
Despite all this chaos, all the tariffs and retaliation,
Uh-huh.
real wages in the U.S. barely changed during Trump's presidency, while at the same time inflation kept going up. Makes you think, did these policies actually help the average American worker?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it sounds like these reports are saying that Trump's tariffs had some pretty big, maybe even unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And these consequences weren't just limited to the U.S., right?
Right. The reports have all these interesting case studies that show how different the impacts were all over the world.
So, like, for instance, one of the reports zooms in on Iowa, which, as we mentioned earlier, was hit hard by those retaliatory tariffs from China.
Especially on agricultural products like soybeans and pork.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So the report says that Iowa farmers got something like $28 billion in subsidies from the U.S. Department of Agriculture
Yeah.
to try to make up for their losses from the tariffs.
Yeah, but here's the thing.
Okay.
Even with that huge bailout, a University of Iowa survey found that 40% of Iowa farmers still said they were in big financial trouble.
Wow. So even with all that government help,
Yeah.
they were still struggling.
Exactly. It really shows how much those tariffs hurt them and how even the government couldn't completely fix it.
And then there's Mexico. The reports talk about how Mexico, being such a close trading partner with the U.S.,
Right.
was really hit hard by all of this.
Absolutely. Mexico saw inflation jump up to like 6.5% in 2019. That might not sound like much, but for families that spend a lot of their income on food.
Which is a lot of families in Mexico.
Exactly. It can be devastating. We have to remember that these kinds of economic shocks don't affect everyone the same way.
It's often those who are already struggling who end up getting hit the hardest.
Exactly. And the reports don't just focus on North America. They also look at what happened in China, which, was pretty significant.
Yeah, one report goes into detail about what happened in Guangdong, a major manufacturing hub in China.
Right.
And they saw unemployment go up to 6.2% in 2019, largely because of the drop in exports to the U.S., because of the tariffs.
It's a reminder that these trade wars have casualties on both sides.
Yeah, for sure.
But even more worrying are the longer-term consequences that these reports dig into.
Right, those immediate impacts we talked about earlier.
Yeah, they were just the beginning.
It's like those supply chain disruptions we talked about.
Those didn't just magically disappear.
No.
The reports point to the global chip shortage in 2021 as a perfect example.
Okay.
According to Bloomberg, that shortage delayed the production of almost 4 million cars.
4 million cars.
Think about all that lost revenue, all those frustrated customers, all the workers who might have been laid off or had their hours cut because production slowed down.
Yeah.
It's like a domino effect with ripples that spread out everywhere.
And the reports say that all these trade tensions actually contributed to a bigger gap between the rich and the poor.
Exactly. They highlight the fact that in the U.S., real wages only grew by like 0.2% per year during Trump's time in office, while inflation averaged 2.3% each year. So while some people might say that the tariffs protected American jobs, the data suggests that a lot of workers didn't really benefit. They might have actually lost ground.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
These reports don't just leave us with a feeling of doom and gloom, do they?
No, thankfully not. They actually offer some really concrete recommendations for moving forward, and some of them are pretty insightful.
Okay, well, let's hear them. What do they suggest?
One big thing is to modernize the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
Okay.
The reports argue that the WTO needs to be more agile and effective at resolving these trade disputes, especially now when these disputes are getting so complex and tied up with politics.
That makes sense. A stronger WTO could help prevent those back and forth tariff wars
Right.
that just end up hurting everyone.
Exactly. What else?
What else do the reports recommend?
They also suggest giving more targeted help to the people who are most vulnerable to these kinds of economic shocks.
Okay.
They specifically mention things like providing direct subsidies to farmers who are hit by retaliatory tariffs, like those soybean farmers in Iowa we talked about.
Right. That seems fair. If governments are going to start these trade wars, they should at least try to help people who get caught in the middle.
I agree, and the reports go even further.
Right.
They suggest that future trade deals should include strong labor and environmental standards. The idea is to make things more fair, and make sure that trade benefits workers and the environment, not just big companies.
So it's about moving away from just thinking about trade as a transaction and towards a more holistic approach that thinks about all the different impacts.
Exactly. The reports argue that we need to move beyond this America First way of thinking and recognize that global trade, when it's done right, can actually be a good thing.
Right.
It can create jobs, boost economies, raise living standards all around the world, but it takes cooperation, not confrontation.
That's a powerful message, and one that seems really relevant right now with all this talk about decoupling and bringing manufacturing back home.
Right. But these reports are saying that there are other options.
Okay.
Besides those trade wars that end up hurting everyone.
Right.
There are ways to promote fair trade support, domestic industries, protect workers without using these protectionist measures that ultimately do more harm than good.
Okay.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where everyone benefits.
So what really stood out to you from all of this? What resonated with you the most from these Trump versus world reports?
I think for me, it's the interconnectedness of everything. These tariffs weren't just about the U.S. and China or even about specific industries. They had ripple effects that went out everywhere,
Right.
affecting farmers in Iowa, factory workers in China, car buyers in Europe, consumers all over the world.
It really shows how much we need global cooperation
Yeah.
and how we're all connected in this global economy.
It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the political arguments, but these reports make us look beyond the surface and think about the real cost of these policies for people.
Yeah, they remind us that trade policy isn't just about numbers. It's about people's lives, their jobs, their families, their ability to, put food on the table and build a future.
And they also say that there are other options.
Yeah.
There are ways to have fair and sustainable trade that benefits everyone.
So if any of this has got you curious, I highly recommend checking out the full reports.
Yeah.
They're packed with interesting details and insights. They even suggest some additional resources that you might find interesting, like a map that shows global tariffs data on food inflation by country.
Wow.
And even firsthand accounts from people who were directly affected by these policies.
It's a real deep dive into a complex and important issue.
Well said. And remember, this has only scratched the surface of this topic.
Right.
There's always more to discover. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
And remember, the choices we make about trade policy today will shape the world of tomorrow.
That's a good point.
It's up to all of us to stay informed and engaged.
Yeah, it's a lot to think about for sure. But these reports, they do a good job of helping us understand all this complicated stuff.
Yeah, they really do. And they remind us that at the heart of all of this trade policy stuff is people, their lives, their jobs, their families.
Right.
It's not just about numbers and economic theories.
Absolutely. So, if these policies can have such a big impact, what are the alternatives? Is there a way to have a more balanced approach to global trade, one that works better for everyone?
Well, the reports do offer some pretty interesting ideas. One thing they say is that we need to rethink how we measure success when it comes to trade. Instead of just looking at the trade deficit,
Right.
they say we need to look at the bigger picture things like how many jobs are being created, whether wages are going up, if the environment is being protected, even things like access to affordable health care and education.
So like moving beyond just the bottom line and thinking about the bigger picture.
Exactly. They're suggesting that a really good trade policy helps everyone, not just a small group of people.
Right.
It's about creating a system that's fair,
Yeah.
where everyone has a chance to succeed, but also where workers and communities are protected.
It sounds like we need to get away from this us versus them idea in trade
Yeah.
and think about things more collaboratively,
Uh-huh.
recognizing that we're all connected in this global economy.
That's a key takeaway for me. The reports really emphasize the need for more dialogue, more cooperation, more willingness to find common ground, and they actually suggest some practical steps to get there.
Okay, like what? Give us some examples.
Well, they talk about the need for stronger international institutions like a reformed WTO that can actually enforce the rules and help settle disputes.
Right.
They also suggest including labor and environmental standards in trade agreements, to make sure that countries aren't just trying to compete by lowering their standards.
Right, to attract investment.
Exactly. And they also talk about investing in education and training so that workers can adapt to the changing demands of the global economy.
So it's about creating a system that isn't just about free trade, it's about fair trade.
Yeah.
A system that helps everyone involved.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that trade policy isn't set in stone. It's something that needs to be constantly reviewed and adjusted to meet the challenges of a world that's constantly changing.
It's a lot to think about,
Mm.
but these reports definitely give us a lot to consider. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Trump's tariffs and their global impact, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all this?
I'd say it's this. Trade policy matters. It affects all of us, whether we realize it or not. It affects the prices we pay, the jobs we have, the environment we live in the future, we build for ourselves and our children.
Right.
It's up to all of us to stay informed,
Yeah.
to be part of these conversations and to push for policies that create a more just and sustainable world.
Well said. And that wraps up our deep dive into the global impact of Trump's tariffs. If you're interested in learning more, I definitely recommend checking out the full Trump versus World reports.
Yeah, they're really good.
They've got tons of interesting details and data and even personal stories from people all over the world whose lives were changed by these policies. You'll find links to the reports and some other resources in the show notes. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, there's always more to discover.